I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I would receive a postcard on occasion from my grandparents as they were traveling, and it was always addressed the same way, to Master Wayne Roberts. In fact, it was so convincing, that statement, that when I got married, I insisted that Tammy refer to me as Master Wayne Roberts. Because I thought my grandmother, who knew me best, if she, as a respectable Christian woman, acknowledged me as the master, then surely I was. Later, I learned that that was not what I thought that it meant. That master was Mr. when applied to a very small mister. When one is a juvenile, it is proper in formal writing to address it as master instead of mister. Tonight we're going to look at a postcard in this ongoing postcard series that is addressed to the lady and her children. Interestingly enough, as 2 John opens, the addressee is not listed by name, but she is actually called in the feminine form of the word Lord. Not the capital L that would refer to the divine, but this would be a master kind of terminology addressed. On top of the confusion is the fact that it is signed, as was customary at the beginning of the letter, it is signed the elder. And so it has left scholars and commentators and preachers and teachers alike to seek who was this postcard of the New Testament addressed to. And I think perhaps postcard is even a stretch of the imagination at only 13 verses. Probably it's a post-it note of the New Testament, but that would be a very short series, 13 verses long. Tonight we're going to look at 2 John. If you have your Bibles with you, whether they're in physical form or electronic form. I remember a preacher friend of mine one time said if you have your printed Bible with you, hold it up in the air. And if you have it on your electronic device, stick your nose up in the air because you're egotistical. But if you have it there, turn over to that very short epistle, the postcard of 2 John, as we'll consider it tonight. The beginning of the book, the salutation as it often calls, the first 3 verses of that read this way, "And the elder to the chosen lady and her children whom I love in truth, and not only I but all who know the truth, for the sake of the truth which abides in us will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and in love." Let's look just at those 2 statements of introduction there by who wrote the epistle and to whom it was received by. There are some disagreements, believe it or not. The idea of the elder here comes from a Greek word, presbyteros, and that is the word that we apply not only to the elders or the shepherds of a local congregation, but it's a word that just means elder one. Some have supposed that since it is written or signed by the elder, that it meant that it was written by a shepherd in a local church, and certainly there's no reason to not believe that, but it in and of itself is not sufficient. It is probably within the literary structure and design and content of this letter that we have selected the author to be the Apostle John, the one who identifies him elsewhere as the beloved, not because he designated him that way, but that is what Jesus referred to him when he walked alongside him as one of his apostles, the beloved one. Much aged now, the letter probably written somewhere between 70 and 80 A.D., towards the end of John's life, and so only appropriate, he says, this old man signs the letter. And so that is easy to determine because we have the entirety of the writing, but who this lady is still, I believe, in the mind of God and a mystery to us. Some suppose her actually to be the mother of Jesus, Mary, who resided with John in Ephesus till her death and perhaps it was John who wrote to her as this particular beloved lady. There are some who that suppose that this is a particular lady. As the letter would go on, it shows someone who perhaps took in boarders, missionaries, if you will, that would come through town, and she would house them and had an opportunity to hear the things that they spoke, and he wanted to caution her about certain missionaries that were coming to her town. There are some that suppose, and I lean this direction, that he is actually writing to a church. Some say that that's difficult because he refers to the lady as having children, and how does a church have children? But I think that we can understand a symbolic analogy there of a church and her members, if you will, being the children of that church. In fact, as he concludes the letter in verse 13, it says, "And the children of your chosen sister greet you." And so this is either the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, or this is the sister of a woman who ran a boarding house. But for me, it's easy to understand that he says, "And the church where I am and her members give you greetings as well." It doesn't really matter because the substance of the letter does not require the addressee. I guess it's kind of like trying to or receiving in the mail a bill that said overdue. And when you read it, you say, well, they misspelled my name. It's clearly not for me. In fact, I often will, when I fill out the paperwork, I will misspell my name. So when it comes back in, I say, surely can't be for me, not due and owing. The substance of the letter is going to be found in what this author is writing to the letter or to the recipient, or more specifically, what God, through the pen of that author, is writing for you and for me. He says in this introduction, he says in verse 3, "Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father, from Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and love." I think it really is the doorstep of what the substance and the subject of 2 John is all about. When we think of those three words, we think of grace and mercy and peace. They all share a common bond. If you will, it is the common bond of love. It is God's love for us that extended his grace. It is that act of love that allowed us to receive the forgiveness. As grace is the unmerited favor, and mercy is the result that is enjoyed because of that unmerited favor. And because of those two being partnered together, we live in peace. It's not in a world without chaos. It's not that there is never any trouble, difficulty, or struggle in our life, but because of God's grace and the receipt of mercy, we live in peace with him. And that is, as Jesus put it, not the peace that the world gives, but the peace that he gives, the peace that passes all understanding. And this begins to serve as I said, an introduction of sort to what I really think the letter is all about. You'll notice that the words truth and love appear in not only the salutation, but as we were to go through the letter, we would see in verse 5, "I have had from the beginning that we love one another." We'll come back and visit that in detail. In verse 6, "This is the love that we walk according to his commandments." And this ongoing theme of love seems to be what the writer is introducing, even though the word truth and commandments appear more often in that. We begin to think about what is the purpose of this, and we ask the question, what is the love and what is the truth that is mentioned here in 2 John? I'll just simply say that for the majority of commentators, they find their camping place alongside of the word truth. And I really have no disagreement with them in that fact that truth is of the utmost importance. Jesus said, "I am the truth, and no man comes to the Father but by me." We know the importance of following Jesus by following his commandments. It is the conclusion of many that really what the writer, and if you will, it's John, that John is saying is that be careful in your love that you not go beyond or you not exceed the truth. And it is the tendency of preachers and teachers alike to lean heavy on the truth aspect of this, the commandment keeping that is essential in walking with Jesus. I don't agree with that. The conclusion that I come to in my study of 2 John, and I simply lay out this evening for your consideration, is that as consistent with, if it is in fact John, his gospel and his other epistles, which we refer to as 1st and 3rd John, that the emphasis of John in all of his writing is this subject of love. And that truth, or there is a truth element that substantiates, that is a foundation to that. We'll talk in a little bit about Jesus' remarks of this balance between love and commandments, but for a moment, let's look at what is written here in 2 John regarding this particular thing. He says in verse 4, the writer, I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth. I'm going to give the slide folks just a bear of a time tonight as we hop through this, but I appreciate it. That's the nice thing. When you're a volunteer, you can't get fired. I just want you to know I volunteered to do this tonight. Okay, my regular job is different, but I'm very glad that some of your children are walking in truth just as we have received commandment to do from the Father. But here the letter takes its turn, or if you will, it jumps into the middle of what I believe it's to be its purpose. I ask you, lady, verse 5, not as writing to you a new commandment, but the one which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments, and this is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, that you should walk in it. And so, as I said, the initial thought is that what he's saying is, listen, since we love God, since we love Jesus, commandment keeping is the call by which we are called. And I think it is just the opposite of that. That we are called to keep the commandments that we might know how to love. My wife, a great scholar and theologian, and I will challenge her against any others. I'm not just saying it because it's her birthday. But she reminds me that without the person of Jesus Christ and this principle of love, the rest of the New Testament makes no sense. And for us, many of us, and I include myself at least for a time, that we have sought to find meaning in the commandments without seeing it through the filter of Jesus and the love that he called us to. And therefore, all we have done is taken an old law of commandments that led towards death because we can't keep commandments, and made a new list of commandments that leads us to not being able to keep the commandments because we're not good commandment keepers. Does that make at least some sense, whether you agree with it or not? Here's where I think the meaning is found, or at least the understanding of this truth is found, and that is in verse 7. Listen to what the author places right in the middle of this. He says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the antichrist. Watch yourselves that you might not lose what we have accomplished, but that you might receive a full reward. The truth that the author is focusing on is this: those who would not acknowledge not just the deity, but the humanity of Jesus Christ. We introduced this theme 2 weeks ago when we looked at the idea of Gnosticism that was beginning to form. And the Gnostics believed that Jesus never came in the flesh, and we're bound by the flesh, and the flesh does terrible things, but it's okay if the spiritual side of us is really good. But they take away the part of Jesus Christ where he, coming in the flesh, demonstrated the supreme love of God And I believe that the writer of the epistle is saying this: without the person of Jesus Christ, the person that came not just from divine, but came from divine into the flesh, it is only by that and through that we can understand what real love is. And therefore, if we were to discount or disregard the truth of who Jesus is, then love is an empty boast. It is without example. It is insufficient. And so he says, you can say all day long, I love, I love, I love. But without the acknowledgement of Jesus Christ, you simply put, don't know what real love is. And so for me, though he goes on to say in the text, anyone who goes too far, actually a word that means progress by its literal translation, but it means to exceed the boundaries. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ, he does not have God, and the one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, and do not give him a greeting, for the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. This is not a broad statement that said those who are false teachers in regards to all the teaching they give. Now, it may be a principle that applies to them, but he is saying if one cannot acknowledge who Jesus Christ is, that's the person for you not to associate with. Now that presents us, granted, a little bit of a challenge, because we know that there are some that acknowledge Jesus for who he is, and yet we don't understand things the way they do, or vice versa. They don't understand things the way we do, and we might need to engage them in a conversation, because somewhere in there between probably where we are and where they are lies the truth. But we have drawn this as a sword to say all of those who don't see the things the way that we see them simply can't be followers or disciples of Jesus. Please do not misunderstand me. I believe there is a place where one is outside of Christ and moves into Christ. I believe that point is at our baptism. I believe that there are those who stray from the truth and they seek their own ways. That's a heart judgment that I can't always make, because at the same time there are some that practice those same things simply out of ignorance, seeking to do what they believe to be the best thing. Again, that's not mine. Typically, when Scripture speaks of a false teacher, it is one who false teaches exactly what 2 John speaks about. The false teacher is the one who denies either the deity or the humanity of Jesus Christ. The one who would disregard the sacrifice, the substitutionary action that he made on the cross for you and I. Because without Jesus, simply put, the rest doesn't matter. And so it is that as we look at this, that we find that this definition of commandment keeping that we have in here is the commandment keeping of recognizing who Jesus Christ is. That is the truth that must be kept. Let me back you up just a minute. Slides, you don't have to move at all. Listen again to verse 5. And now I ask you, lady, not writing a new commandment, but the one which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. Now we might say, well, there's a plurality of commandments. But he goes to say, this is the commandment that you have heard from the beginning, that you should walk in it. It is the commandment that he made in that he referred to in verse 5 and verse 6. Here is the great commandment of God in Jesus Christ. Love one another. I appreciate the way that Tucker introduced our worship this evening in this idea of us being able to come together to love each other, to express our love for one another, to collectively express our love to God for him and for his ways. But all of that is mute and void if we don't consider the person of Jesus Christ. Let me turn you over to a couple of passages of Scripture, and I got to be honest, I can't remember if I put them in the slides or not, because I don't look at the slides very much. That's what you have to look at. Let's consider what Jesus writes in John chapter 14 and verse 21. He says, "Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." Again, we have found ourselves believing that the commandment of love is to keep the commandment. Let me just get you to think beyond your typical boundaries. This one may hurt just a little bit. If my wife were to say, "Do you love me?" and I were to say, "Of course I love you," I'm commanded to. I'm required to. Law obligates me to love you. And as such, I have fulfilled the commandment to love you. I could tell you what she would say. "You don't love me." That doesn't just mean it has to be a ooey gooey, butterflies in the stomach, emotionalistic response to how wonderful and beautiful she is. But on the one hand, when I ask her, "Do you love me?" she says, "I've done everything I'm supposed to do." Right? I have fulfilled the requirements of being a wife, whoever it was that dedicated those things. Yeah, but do you love me? And so for us to understand Jesus' statement that he says that "I know you love me because you keep the commandments" is the wrong syntax. He said, "It is because you love me that you hear my words, that you follow after me, that you want to be close to me." I fear that we have left a generation of churches that believed that the love of God was keeping the laws of God, instead of that the love of God is what compels us to keep the so-called laws of God. Now that may seem merely as semantics to you, but it seems to be significant to me. And it was significant enough that the writer of 2 John, I believe, made the exact same emphasis. Let's move on to one other passage, John chapter 15. I go back to this because it is a more expanded view of what Jesus had to say. He says, "Abide, reside, live, walk in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made full." Listen, he's going to give you the commandment right here. He says, if you love me, keep the commandments. I love you, Jesus. What's the commandments? It's really not about giving on the first day of the week. It's really not about all the other things that we might delineate. He says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." It is this commandment that the writer of 2 John looks back to, and he says, this is not a new commandment. It is the one that we have had and sought to practice from the very beginning. And that is that we love one another. And be careful of those that would claim love and yet deny the person of Jesus Christ. For in him we have not the commandment of love, we have the example of love. An example of love that will take us beyond our wants, our desires, our wishes, our lusts, and all those kinds of things, but a love that seeks the well-being of others. And things like that we think of as don't steal and don't kill and don't gossip. Those all are not commandments to be kept. They are expressions of love as we live out our lives. And so, as we move to the very end here, I simply want you to understand that the command is to love, and we love because of who Jesus is. For me, that's what 2 John is all about. Take away Jesus, we don't know what love is. We do rely upon how we feel, or our experience or our relationship of history or our commonalities or the things that we share from the standpoint of our hobbies. And John says that's insufficient. That's shallow love. Simply put, we love because who Jesus is, and who Jesus is the reason why we love. And I believe that's the message of 2 John. The reason it's so important is because it was important to you and I. That as my father and I can hear his words, though he has been dead for more than 15 years. It's been that long since I've heard him preach a sermon, perhaps even longer than he said this. That the day that Jesus said, I love you this much, and he allowed himself to be hung on a cross to show us how much he loves us and to show us how much we should love others. It is unfortunate when we live love as a commandment, then we live the commandments because of our love. The love of God in Jesus Christ is a love that was not restrained simply to those who we consider the saved. It was that which was offered to all as it was to us when we were still in our sin. And tonight, the love of God in Jesus Christ is open and extended to every single one of you. And if your declaration tonight is that Jesus Christ is exactly who he claimed he is, God in the flesh, offered as a sacrifice, buried as a body, resurrected to a new life, ascended to heaven with an eventual return within his time. If that is your acknowledgement, you are well on your way to loving like no other. But that requires a response. And we do so not by habit, but by appropriate opportunity to say, if tonight you're ready to love like Jesus, well, then you need to know him. And to know him, you need to be in a relationship with him. And to be in a relationship with him, you need to turn your life over to him. And it may be that tonight's your night. As one Anna this morning said, I'm ready to be a true all-in follower of Jesus. And she was immersed in water for the remission of her sin and went from outside to inside, from condemned to clean. She went from a place of hopelessness to a hope. If you'd like that hope and have not made that decision, tonight's your night. Maybe it is that you said, I've been trying to love like I thought I was supposed to love. And I kind of forgot about Jesus and all of that. I'm sorry for that. Maybe it is that you just need the prayers of this congregation. We give you that opportunity to do so. We always say you can write us, but it is write to our shepherds at elders@mcoc.org, and they'll pray for you. If you want to be public, we'll all pray for you. We'll make mention of it. If there's a way tonight that we can help any of you who are here, or even if you're online, if you'll contact us, we'll help you in any way that we can. I hope you'll consider these things as we learn better to love one another, simply put, because of Jesus. Let's stand and encourage one another.